In the early hours of a quiet Atlantic morning, long before satellites watched every wave, and long before nuclear power became routine, something unimaginable was being prepared behind guarded gates and steel fences. It did not carry missiles yet. It did not carry aircraft yet, but it carried an idea so powerful that it would change naval warfare forever. This was not just another aircraft carrier. This was the moment the ocean entered the nuclear age, and the ship at the center of that moment was USS Enterprise. Before Enterprise existed, the world's navies were constrained by fuel. Every carrier, no matter how powerful, was chained to logistics. Oilers followed fleets like shadows. Operations were planned not by ambition, but by range. When fuel ran low, even the strongest fleet had to turn back. In war, that limitation could decide everything. During World War II, carriers proved their value. They reshaped combat, sank battleships, and dominated the skies. But they also revealed a weakness: endurance. A carrier could project power, but only for as long as its fuel allowed. By the early Cold War, the world had changed. The oceans were no longer buffers between continents. They were front lines, and the United States Navy faced a terrifying question. What happens when a war never pauses? The Cold War was not a war of battles. It was a war of presence. American carriers had to remain at sea, not for days, not for weeks, but for months at a time. They had to operate without warning, without ports, without resupply. They had to be everywhere, always, and conventional power could not do that. At the same time, another revolution was quietly unfolding. Nuclear reactors, once used only for weapons, were now being miniaturized, stabilized, and adapted for propulsion. Submarines had already proven what nuclear power could do beneath the surface. Unlimited range, unmatched endurance. No more need for air, fuel, or refueling. The Navy asked a radical question. What if that power could be brought to the surface? The answer was Enterprise, but not the Enterprise the world expected. Not a simple upgrade. Not an experiment. What the Navy proposed was something no country had ever attempted: a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. Not one reactor, not two. 8 nuclear reactors working together, driving 4 massive shafts, producing power that no conventional ship could match. The scale was unprecedented, the risk was enormous, and failure was not an option. Construction began in the late 1950s, at a time when nuclear power still inspired fear as much as confidence. Every weld was scrutinized. Every system was questioned. Every calculation was checked and rechecked. This ship would carry thousands of sailors. It would operate reactors in the open ocean. It would serve as a moving symbol of American technological dominance. If it failed, the consequences would echo far beyond the shipyard. She was longer than any warship before her, heavier, more complex. Her hull stretched over 1,100 feet long, than 3 football fields. Inside, she was less a ship and more a floating city. Reactor compartments, control rooms, engineering spaces, layered with redundancy. Every system existed in duplicate, sometimes triplicate, because in nuclear propulsion, there is no margin for error. When Enterprise was launched, the world watched, not because she looked different, but because she was different. She represented something deeper than steel and machinery. She represented permanence. Where conventional carriers would come and go, Enterprise could stay. Where fleets once planned around fuel, they now planned around mission. Where oceans once limited power, they now amplified it. In 1961, USS Enterprise was commissioned. The moment she officially entered service, naval warfare crossed an invisible line. For the first time in history, a surface warship could sail indefinitely without refueling. No more smokestacks. No more fuel bunkers dictating operations. No more dependence on supply lines. Enterprise could circle the globe and keep going. Her very existence changed strategy. Enemy planners could no longer predict when a carrier would withdraw. There was no more refueling window to exploit. No more logistical pause to attack. Enterprise introduced a new uncertainty into global conflict. You never knew when she would leave because she didn't have to. Inside the ship, life adjusted to this new reality. Sailors trained not only as seamen and aviators, but as nuclear operators. Reactor discipline became culture. Precision became habit. Every valve mattered. Every checklist mattered. Enterprise did not forgive mistakes, and that expectation shaped generations of sailors. But the true power of USS Enterprise was not hidden in her reactors. It was on her deck. Enterprise carried air wings capable of striking hundreds of miles inland, fighter jets, bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, all launched from a ship that never needed to slow down. She could reposition across oceans without warning, appear where no carrier was expected, sustain operations longer than any adversary believed possible. In the Cold War, surprise was everything. Enterprise specialized in it. Her first deployment sent a clear message. This was not a prototype to be tested cautiously. This was a frontline weapon. She sailed with confidence, fast, silent in her endurance, relentless in presence. Allies were reassured, adversaries were unsettled. Because Enterprise did not just represent military power, she represented technological inevitability. As the 1960s unfolded, tensions rose across the globe. Proxy wars, nuclear brinkmanship, ideological confrontation on every continent. And wherever the United States needed to demonstrate resolve, Enterprise was there. She was not always visible, but she was always close, waiting. Historians would later say that USS Enterprise was not merely a ship of her time. She was a ship ahead of time, built for wars that had not yet been fought, prepared for crises not yet imagined. Her design would influence every nuclear carrier that followed. She became the blueprint, the standard, the proof that nuclear power at sea was not just possible, it was unstoppable. But the ocean does not reward ambition alone. It tests it. And Enterprise would soon face her first true trial, not in theory, not in exercises, but in the reality of global conflict. A war where endurance mattered, where presence mattered, where the ability to stay when others had to leave would define victory. The war was Vietnam, and USS Enterprise was about to discover what it meant to carry nuclear power into a conventional war. When the Vietnam War began to dominate headlines, it was not supposed to become what it did. Planners expected limited engagement, short deployments, controlled escalation. What they got instead was a grinding, unpredictable conflict that demanded constant presence, uninterrupted air power, and endurance measured not in weeks, but in years. And this was where USS Enterprise became something no more carrier had ever been before. Not just a strike platform, but a permanent instrument of pressure. The war in Vietnam was fought far from American shores, yet it unfolded under the constant shadow of global politics. China watched from the north. The Soviet Union watched from afar. Every American action risked provoking a wider conflict. Carriers were essential, but also vulnerable. They had to stay close enough to launch strikes, yet far enough to avoid escalation. They had to operate continuously, yet discreetly. With nuclear propulsion, Enterprise was no longer bound by the same constraints. She did not need fuel tankers shadowing her every move. She did not need to break station for refueling. She did not need to calculate how long she could remain before logistics forced a withdrawal. She could stay, and in Vietnam, staying mattered more than anything else. From the Gulf of Tonkin, Enterprise launched wave after wave of aircraft, strike missions, reconnaissance flights, combat air patrols, day after day, night after night. Her flight deck became a rhythm of motion, jets screaming down the catapults, recovery crews guiding aircraft home, maintenance teams working through exhaustion to keep the air wing flying. This was not dramatic warfare. This was industrialized aviation. Enterprise set records that no more carrier had ever approached. She conducted operations at a tempo that stunned even experienced naval officers. Sortie after sortie, deployment after deployment. While other carriers rotated out, Enterprise remained. She became a constant, a fixed point in an otherwise chaotic war. For the sailors aboard her, the strain was immense. Months at sea blurred together. Combat operations became routine. Routine became dangerous. Fatigue crept in, not just physical, but mental. Yet the ship's systems, her reactors, her propulsion, never faltered. While human endurance was tested, the ship itself remained steady. That reliability became a quiet advantage. Pilots trusted the deck would be there when they returned. Commanders trusted the carrier would remain on station. But Vietnam was not without cost. In 1969, Enterprise suffered one of the most serious accidents in her history. A rocket motor overheated on the flight deck. Seconds later, explosions tore through parked aircraft. Fuel ignited. Munitions detonated. Fire spread with terrifying speed. For a moment, the unthinkable seemed possible. A nuclear-powered aircraft carrier on fire. What followed was not panic. it was discipline. Sailors fought flames through smoke and heat. Damage control teams isolated burning sections. Aircraft were pushed overboard to prevent further explosions. The ship survived, but 28 sailors lost their lives. The incident was a brutal reminder. Even the most advanced warship in the world was still vulnerable to human error and chance. Enterprise carried that lesson forward. Despite the tragedy, operations resumed. The war did not pause. Enterprise returned to duty, scarred, repaired, but unbroken. Her presence in Vietnam continued, because in war, there are no perfect ships, only ships that endure. Despite the tragedy, operations resumed. The war did not pause. Enterprise returned to duty, scarred, repaired, but unbroken. Her presence continued as the conflict dragged on. Enterprise became more than a weapon. She became a symbol. To American allies, she represented commitment. To adversaries, she represented persistence. No matter how long the war lasted, she remained offshore, silent in endurance, relentless in capability. And Vietnam continued. Yet Vietnam also revealed something else. Air power alone could not decide everything. Sorties could suppress, bombardments could pressure, but wars were ultimately decided on land. Enterprise could influence the conflict, but she could not end it. This reality weighed heavily on those who served aboard her. They launched missions knowing that success did not always mean resolution. When the United States finally began withdrawing from Vietnam, Enterprise was still there. She had outlasted strategies, outlasted expectations, outlasted assumptions. Her reactors never needed refueling. Her hull never needed rest. She had proven that nuclear propulsion was not just a technological triumph, it was a strategic revolution. But the Cold War was far from over. If Vietnam was a test of endurance, what came next would be a test of global reach. The world was entering an era of constant crisis, Middle East tensions, nuclear brinkmanship, proxy conflicts on multiple continents, and Enterprise, already proven, was about to take on a new role, not as a warfighter alone, but as a signal that American power could arrive anywhere and stay. Her next missions would take her into some of the most volatile regions on Earth, and in those waters, endurance was no longer just an advantage. It was the difference between deterrence and disaster. By the early 1970s, the Vietnam War was winding down, but the world was not becoming safer. It was becoming more unstable. The Cold War had entered a new phase. Not loud, not explosive, but tense, unpredictable, and dangerously close to disaster. And in this world, USS Enterprise found a new purpose, not as a hammer, but as a warning. The United States and the Soviet Union no longer measured power by territory alone. They measured it by reaction time. How fast could you respond to a crisis? How long could you stay? How difficult were you to remove once you arrived? In this equation, Enterprise was uniquely powerful. She didn't need access to friendly ports. She didn't need fuel stops. She didn't need advance notice. She could appear and remain. Throughout the 1970s, Enterprise was dispatched repeatedly to hotspots where diplomacy was fragile and escalation was always one mistake away. The Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf. Each deployment carried a message that required no press release. We are here, we can act, and we are not leaving. One of the most dangerous moments came in 1973. The Yom Kippur War erupted suddenly in the Middle East, drawing in regional powers and threatening to pull the superpowers into direct confrontation. Israel fought for survival. Arab states mobilized. The Soviet Union moved to support its allies. The United States responded not with words, but with carriers. Enterprise was ordered to move fast. As she steamed toward the Mediterranean, Soviet surveillance ships followed. Submarines tracked her movements. Aircraft shadowed her flight operations. This was no coincidence. This was a test. Two nuclear powers maneuvering massive military assets in close proximity, each trying to signal resolve without triggering catastrophe. Enterprise's flight deck became a stage. Aircraft launched not to attack, but to be seen. Every takeoff was deliberate. At any moment, a miscalculation could have escalated the situation beyond control. A radar lock mistaken for aggression, an intercept flown too close, a weapons system misread. Enterprise's role was not to fight, but to hold the line, and she did. The Cold War was filled with moments like this, most of them never publicized, never acknowledged, never celebrated. But carriers like Enterprise stood at the center of them, quietly preventing wars that never happened. As the 1980s began, the global balance shifted again. The Soviet Navy expanded its reach. New cruisers, new submarines, new anti-ship missiles designed specifically to kill aircraft carriers. Enterprise was no longer facing outdated threats. She was facing systems built to destroy ships exactly like her. This forced another evolution. Her air wing changed. New aircraft arrived, faster, smarter, more lethal. Electronic warfare platforms jammed enemy sensors. Early warning aircraft scanned hundreds of miles in every direction. Fighters escorted strike groups deep into contested airspace. Enterprise became not just a launch platform, but the command center of a floating battle network. Yet even as technology advanced, the ship herself aged. Steel fatigued, systems required constant upgrades, maintenance cycles grew longer. But the core of Enterprise, the reactors, the propulsion, the endurance, remained unmatched. She could still outlast anyone sent to watch her. In 1986, Enterprise once again moved into a volatile theater, Libya. Following terrorist attacks linked to the Libyan regime, the United States prepared retaliatory strikes. Carriers were central to the plan. Enterprise provided cover, flexibility, and presence. While other forces executed the mission, she ensured something equally important: control of escalation. If the situation widened, she was already in place. By the late 1980s, cracks began appearing in the Cold War itself. The Soviet Union was weakening, economic strain mounted, political change followed, but until the very end, uncertainty remained. Enterprise continued to deploy, continued to patrol, continued to be ready, because no one could predict how or how violently the Cold War would end. Then suddenly, it was over. The Soviet Union collapsed, the world exhaled, and Enterprise, after decades of preparing for a war that never came, found herself in a world that no longer made sense. Yet history was not finished with her, because the post-Cold War era brought new conflicts, messier conflicts, asymmetric conflicts, conflicts without clear front lines, and once again, Enterprise was called. She supported operations in the Middle East, provided air cover during crises, served as a stabilizing presence in regions where instability spread faster than armies. Her role had changed, but her value had not. By the time the 21st century arrived, Enterprise was no longer the newest carrier. She was not the most advanced, but she was the most experienced. She had seen more crises than any ship afloat. She had outlasted entire generations of warships, and she had proven something profound, that endurance, true endurance, was a weapon in itself. But even legends must end. Steel ages, technology advances, new ships take the stage. The question was never if Enterprise would retire, only how history would remember her. By the time the 21st century arrived, USS Enterprise had already lived several lifetimes. She had been born into the nuclear age, she had survived Vietnam, she had stared down the Soviet Union, she had outlasted strategies, doctrines, and even nations. Yet history was about to demand something new from her. Not deterrence, not symbolic presence, but war. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the world changed in a matter of hours. Passenger aircraft became weapons, cities became targets, and the certainty of the post-Cold War era collapsed overnight. The United States Navy did not wait for clarity. It moved. As Operation Enduring Freedom began, Enterprise took station in the North Arabian Sea. From there, her aircraft flew some of the longest combat missions in naval aviation history. Hours-long flights, mid-air refueling, precision strikes deep inland. This was a different kind of war. No fleets to confront, no coastlines to bombard. The enemy was dispersed, hidden, and unconventional. Yet Enterprise adapted again. Her role was no longer about overwhelming a rival navy. It was about sustained pressure. Her air wing provided close air support, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, rapid response strike capability. She became a floating air base, one that could move, reposition, and remain immune to political constraints ashore. For sailors aboard Enterprise, the contrast was striking. They were serving on a ship designed to fight nuclear war, now supporting counterterrorism operations. Yet the fundamentals remain unchanged. Launch, recover, maintain, repeat. The ship's age did not slow her. If anything, it added to her credibility. As operations continued, Enterprise also supported missions tied to Iraq, no-fly zones, deterrence patrols, regional stability operations. Again and again, her presence sent a clear message. American power was not tied to bases. It was not limited by geography. It sailed with the fleet. By now, however, the strain of time was undeniable. Enterprise required more maintenance than newer carriers. Her systems demanded constant attention. Her unique 8-reactor design, once revolutionary, had become expensive to sustain. And yet, every time retirement was discussed, reality intervened. She was still useful, still capable, still trusted. There was also something else. Enterprise was not just a ship. She was a symbol. Generations of sailors had served aboard her. Generations of aviators had launched from her deck. Entire careers had unfolded within her steel walls. To retire her was not just a logistical decision, it was an emotional one. In 2012, the decision could no longer be postponed. After more than 50 years of service, USS Enterprise prepared for her final deployment. There was no dramatic announcement, no sudden withdrawal. She did what she had always done. She sailed. When Enterprise finally returned home for the last time, there were no parades. There was respect. The Navy knew what she had given. More than 25 deployments, hundreds of thousands of flight operations, service across every major conflict, from Vietnam to the War on Terror. She had outlasted expectations by decades. Decommissioning a nuclear-powered carrier is not a simple act. It is a process measured in years. Reactors must be defueled, systems dismantled, hazards removed. Even in retirement, Enterprise demanded precision. On December 1, 2012, USS Enterprise was officially decommissioned. The ceremony was quiet, deliberate, worthy of the ship it honored. Her name, long associated with innovation, endurance, and resolve, was carried forward, but the ship herself would never sail again. Most warships are remembered for what they destroyed. Enterprise is remembered for what she made possible. Decades of stability, deterrence without escalation, power without pause. She was not built to be dramatic. She was built to last, and in that mission, she succeeded beyond anything her designers could have imagined. When USS Enterprise was decommissioned in 2012, something unusual happened. The ocean did not gain another retired ship. It lost an era. Because Enterprise was not just a carrier that served for decades. She was the only one of her kind. No more ship before her existed like this. No more ship after her ever will. Every aircraft carrier that sails today traces its lineage back to Enterprise. The reactors, the endurance, the doctrine, but none carry her story. Because Enterprise was not simply advanced, she was experimental in reality, tested not in theory, but in war. She proved nuclear propulsion at sea was safe. She proved it was reliable. She proved it was decisive. And she did so not in a laboratory, but across half a century of conflict. Enterprise was the bridge between two worlds, between oil and nuclear power, between conventional war and global deterrence, between battleships and carriers as kings of the sea. She was built at a time when failure was possible and consequences were unforgiving. That alone makes her irreplaceable. Modern carriers are more efficient. They use fewer reactors. They rely on newer automation. They carry more advanced aircraft. None were asked to prove the concept from scratch. Enterprise had no more precedent. She was the precedent. Her 8-reactor design was never repeated, not because it failed, but because it taught the Navy exactly what was needed and what was not. She was overbuilt on purpose. Engineers did not yet know how nuclear carriers should behave at sea, so they gave her redundancy upon redundancy. That design philosophy kept her alive longer than anyone expected. There's another reason no more ship will ever replace her. Enterprise lived long enough to be reinterpreted again and again. She was a Cold War deterrent. She was a Vietnam workhorse. She was a post-Cold War stabilizer. She was a war on terror strike platform. Very few weapons survived long enough to fight 4 generations of war. Even in retirement, her influence continues. The Nimitz-class carriers owe their existence to her success. The Ford-class carriers owe their confidence to her legacy. Without Enterprise, the idea of nuclear-powered surface fleets might have remained theoretical. She turned theory into reality. And yet, perhaps her greatest contribution was psychological. Enterprise changed how adversaries thought. During the Cold War, Soviet planners did not ask, "Where is the carrier group?" They asked, "Has Enterprise arrived yet?" Because once she did, she wasn't leaving. There was no refueling window, no predictable withdrawal, no logistical pause. She broke the enemy's calendar.
Today, her name lives on. A new USS Enterprise will sail again someday, but it will not be this Enterprise. It will not carry the burden of proving nuclear power. It will not carry the scars of Vietnam. It will not carry the weight of decades spent holding the line between peace and catastrophe. Things cannot be rebuilt. They can only be remembered. Walk her decks in memory, and you do not see steel. You see history in motion, jets launching toward distant wars, radar screens glowing in tense silence, sailors standing watch while the world slept, unaware of how close it came to conflict. Enterprise did not end wars. She prevented them. She did not seek glory. She provided certainty. She did not demand attention. She commanded it. And that is why no ship will ever truly replace USS Enterprise CVN-65, because legends are not built again. They are lived once.